Well, hi there guys, or gals, anybody. Just put a quick vid on just some thoughts on doing hand sanding for your blade. So this isn't a specific how-to, it's just some general things around that. Now basically, what I would say is the first thing obviously is have somewhere solid to actually put your work on there. Now I'm basically sat at the end of a solid bench, so it's not going to move. I've screwed down some thick 18mm ply. Then I've got my old piece of timber that I used to use. That I've actually got a piece of steel that I cut and shaped and hardened to go on there. This particular piece of steel, I'll just show you what it is I'm talking about. So basically this is what I use for my sanding. There's a piece of steel on here so everything keeps nice and flat. The one thing to be careful with wood is that the grit can actually get underneath the blade and get it'll stick into the timber. So then if you've got some coarse grits in there, then you'll start to notice that on the finer grits. But on this actual plate here, I have a couple of holes around this area. I've got a knife clamped, I've only got one hand, so it's a bit hard to show you, but there's two little holes I drilled before I hardened it. And that allows me to put screws through any small knives that I might be going to use or do, like little neck knives, things like that. And that allows me to clamp them flat onto here for when I'm doing my sanding so they don't have to go into vices. Another way you can actually do that, and which I have used, is the welder's magnet. You can get a welder's magnet, put a small blade on top of that, put that into a vice or something like that. But what I would say is that tends to work only on the smaller blades, because the reason I use a full length here is to support the full length of the blade. If not, you can get quite a bit of flex, and also you're risking damage if you've got a tapered tang or you've got a rat tail tang or anything like that. You're risking damage in it, so it's much safer and it's much easier just to keep the whole work, clamped full length for working on. The next thing I would say is I have a chair. The most beloved bought me a rather nice chair, and it just allows me to get comfy. You can be here for quite some time. I can be sat here and sanding away, and it's not a quick job. So being comfortable really helps, and just more by luck than anything else. The stool that she got me allows me to sit at my work. My hands at approximately 90 degrees. And then basically it allows me to sit and work in this kind of technique, which allows you to use the bigger muscles. I'm not having to be at a funny angle or up or down, and I can actually I can lean my body weight on here to get some pressure on there, and I'm using the bigger muscles, so you can keep going for a lot longer without getting fatigued. So it's very important to get yourself nice and comfy. The next thing is make sure you've got adequate lighting. You want good lighting around you, just in general. That really helps. And then also I have a small light directly above my work. The reason for that is what you'll find is if you get that light reflecting on your work and move with it, don't just sit there and assume. Actually use that light, push that light up and down, and it's amazing how just the slightest bit of a shadow can hide little scratches or imperfections or flat areas and things like that, or not flat areas and things like that. So it's not just a case of putting the light there, it's actually constantly moving around and looking for the reflection of the little scratch marks that you've actually got on the work. So it's very useful to have that. You don't want anything majorly bright, because then you give yourself a headache, but something like that, it really does help when you set yourself up. The next thing is the things I actually use when I'm doing my sanding. Now there's different things and different people use different techniques. Basically I've got a piece of steel. This is, I think it's about 6-8mm steel. I machined this flat, so I've got a nice flat surface to work on, and it allows me to get a good grip. I'm not, sometimes, when I first started doing this, I was on almost like I don't know, I'm trying to think what it was I used. I think it might have just been a piece of linen micarta or something like that, and you're rubbing it. And what I found is just something, I've gone, rather than getting smaller, I've got bigger, and I found that just gives me a much more control. And if I've got heavy sanding, I can get plenty of weight on here and pressure on here, stays nice and flat. That's the reason I use a flat piece of steel. My three main pieces here have all got flat steel on them, and the reason for that is I don't make hollow ground knives. It's just not something I do. So I tend to stick to the things that I'm doing. I'm trying to become very good at the things I do, rather than not very good at lots and lots of other things. So, but what this does is this allows me to get my surfaces flat, no matter what happens, whether I'm doing the flats on the Scandis or if I've got a higher grind. It allows me to get those surfaces flat, and I know that they're flat because I'm sanding them flat. However, what I do know a lot of people use is something along the lines of this. Now you can see this is again just a piece of steel. Now in here I have a piece of leather. It's a couple of mil leather, so it's just got a little bit of give in it. I cover it with duct tape, gaffer tape, anything like that. The reason is when you've got a piece of leather, this is an older one I sometimes use as a shim, it will soak up the oil that you're using or whatever it is you're using on the blade, and eventually the glue just piles off and they're constantly falling off. I found by putting this over it and that little bit of waterproofing on it, this has lasted for quite some time now. Obviously it will wear out, but it has lasted a lot longer. The reason a lot of people go for these, it gives that little bit of give. So when you're sanding over a blade, especially a blade that isn't necessarily a full height grind or a particular flat area you're wanting, you will find when you're sanding it, the way I do it, is you see that difference in the marks when you're going over, for argument's sake, a sabre grind or something like that. I don't worry about that as I'm going through the grits, but some people use these because it will actually form a little bit to the blade. I'm more concerned with making sure everything's flat to start with and everything's exactly how I want it, because this will it will cover some imperfections. However, the reason I have this and what I use this for is on the very last grit that I do, whatever grit it is that I'm finishing with, I do single direction movements. And the single direction sanding, as you can see, just off, all the way down, up, off, it removes any fish hooks off the blade. So it removes all those little swirls that you get on the blade. So it's down and across. Now, what I actually do is I put this on flat, but then I just lift it very, very slightly. And I'm actually really, when I'm finishing, I'm only looking at using just sort of maybe a quarter of it, just that top quarter. And that just allows me to get right to the bottom and off. And right to the bottom and off, and it removes those fish hooks. So that's when I use that, and that then evens out the lines over any sort of sabre grind areas or any transition areas. But I just, like I say, I only use that on the last one. That's just my preference. Obviously, if you're going to do an odd one and that's nice for you, you'll get a very nice finish, even if you use a little bit of a tip like that. When you're doing right the way through your sanding, it will blend it in a little bit nicer for you when you get going, and obviously cut a little bit of time out there. As far as sanding papers go, I use Rhino Wet. I'm not sponsored. I don't get anything given at all, ever. But I've just found that it's a very similar price to whatever you'd pay anywhere else. I buy it in packs of 50. Buying it in the packs of 50, it's nearly half the price of the single sheets of anything else at Bunnings or Mitre 10 or anywhere else like that. And I find it cuts quicker and it lasts longer. And so that's why I use it. I've tried a lot of different papers. I've still got odd ones which I'm using now, and they're perfectly good. They're just not quite as good. If you're doing an odd knife, it really wouldn't matter. This is a Norton one. The Nortons are good papers. Don't go for the cheap ones. Don't pick up the cheap packs of sandpapers you can see, or glass papers and wet and dries you can see in some shops. They literally, whereas, I mean, I've had papers where literally I've gone up and down the blade 4 or 5 times and the grit has gone, literally gone. Middle of the road you might get 20 to 30. The Rhino Wet, to actually exhaust a particular piece, I'm looking at, depending on the grit, somewhere between 60, 70 and 100. So it cuts for twice as long as the other stuff that I've used. I still have some of this from experimenting with other things, so I've got the last few little bits in there, and then I won't be buying any more of that. I'll be going on to the Rhino Wet in those sizes. So that's the papers that I use and why. Now, as to oil, I'm actually, this is the one I'm using at the minute. Hopefully that shows up. It's CRC 556. This is just a little spray adapter. The reason I went to this previously, I tended to use something like this in the spray cans, or I'm trying to think of the other one in the spray cans. WD-40. You've got your WD-40 and your CRC, your two main ones. The reason I went away from that was twofold. One was I'm just more concerned as I get older about what's used as a propellant in the oils. And I don't know, I know in the past there has been queries about whether that's good for your health or not. So, and I was looking around and found this stuff, and I thought, well, I'll give it a bit of a try. And it's just the plain oil in it's a little spray thing. It's not a pressurized job. And what I found is when this goes on, as I've just put on there, it doesn't evaporate. Well, probably will, but very, very slowly. So it sits there and it's constantly cleaning out that paper. The whole point of it is, as a lubricant, is to get the scurf away from the paper and allow the paper to keep cutting. And even the spray ones I used, they tended to they evaporated to a certain extent. So you're having to stop to put more on. So it's more time, and they're a lot more expensive. Although I do buy this in bulk. A big carton of it, but in that big carton, it's worked out far cheaper than using the sprays. Previously, I've used petrol because I actually had a load given. But the problem with that is I found, especially when warmer weather, the fumes that come off it, and also it evaporates much quicker. So you're constantly having to put it on, or else it just dries up, and then you're left with no lubricant on there. So that's why I've gone to that particular type of oil. I'm sure that other makers do that. I mean, WD-40 might do the same thing in a big can, just the oil itself. But it works. What doesn't work are things like, say, motor oil, vegetable oil, 3-in-1 oil, things like that don't work. The actual oil is too thick. And what happens is, as soon as you get to the slightly higher grits, what you'll find is that the oil actually forms a film over the top, and that film is actually thicker than the size of the grits on the paper you're using. So it doesn't work. I am experimenting at the minute using something like this. This is Simple Green. It doesn't really matter. There's lots of other makes of window cleaner out there for the really higher grits. So from sort of like, say, the 1,000 grit and up, I'm experimenting with this stuff because, again, it's thinner than the oil, and therefore you get more grip, more abrasion. The problem I'm finding is this stuff tends to slough up very quickly, whereas the oil tends to push the slough away. This doesn't, and it builds up and clogs the papers quicker. So at the minute it's a bit of a toss-up whether it just takes a little bit longer with the oil or you're constantly sloughing up with this stuff. Don't just use water though. I have known guys who use water with a drop of washing up liquid in it. I believe this stuff is alkaline. And so there's no problems with rusting, and I did try before I even started using it. I sprayed a blade up, both a pre-hardened and a post-hardened blade, and just left them and see what happened. And there was no problems at all with rust or anything like that. So it's obviously like I think it's an alkaline. I think. So yeah, so the jury's still out a little bit with that, but sometimes it's worth a try if it cuts the amount of time down and the cost down from from what you're actually doing. The next sort of thing I would say is when it comes to the papers, and you're using your grit, I do the straight and 45-degree technique. So I'll start whatever grit I'm starting off with. If I go straight up and down the blade with that grit, the next grit I use, I go up 45 degrees, and I time that so that whatever grit I'm intending to finish off, I finish straight. And then what I do is I actually sand that straight to get all the marks off, and then I'll go to my little softer piece, and that's what I use to take the fish hooks out and put the single direction lines all the way down. So that's basically, if you don't do that, it will bite you in the arse, because no matter how good you think you've done those lines and you go on to the next one, 2 or 3 grits down, you will see marks. And all I'll say is, when you start, take your time with the bigger grits, like the whatever you're using. 60. I start with 80s. I don't go lower than 80, and that's really, if that's there in case I bugger up my grind. If I buggered up my grind, that allows me to save it, because it's a lot more handwork, but it lets you save it rather than chasing it on a machine where you can make things worse very quickly. A little bit more time just saves that piece of work, especially by the time you've got to post heat treatment. So, but if you're going to spend that time on the 120, make sure you've got every single mark out before you move on to the next one. Don't kid yourself into thinking, oh, it's tiny, it'll come out as I go through the grits. No, it won't. All that will happen is it will show up more and more as you go through the grits. It won't go away, it just gets worse. Why, I'm not too sure, but it does. So work through your grits, nice and steady, make sure you get all the way through there. A quick little tip, I've got one here that I've got so far, and I doubt very much you can actually see the writing on there. But what I do is if I've got more than one on the go, or even if I've got one and I think I get to the end, like yesterday, I finished shift yesterday and it was time to go get the boys out. So I actually write, I've got a little Sharpie, and I actually write on the blade the last grit that I used on which, because it might be that you've got different grits on different sides, depending if you get called away or you've got to move, you've got to suddenly just leave it, or it's the end of the day or whatever. So I actually write the grits that the last grit that I used on the blade, and I always do it the same way. It's the last grit. So this one says 120 on both sides, so I know the last grit on there was 120, so I'm time to go to the 240. Same thing I did with this. I finished at about 800 last night, so this morning I'm on to the 1000. Another thing I would say is be careful. Don't try and jump the gun, as in think, oh, I'll do 3 or 4 grits on one side, then I'm not wasting my time turning the knife backwards and forwards. Because what happens is the slough and the oil will go over the edges and it'll go around, it gets underneath the blade. So you can clean one side down to 600 grit if you want, then you turn it over and you wipe your work off and everything, turn it over. But then as you go back to maybe a 120 grit, that 120 grit coming off the paper and the slough and the oil is going to go around and under your blade, and you're going to scratch that 600 finish off. So what I'll do is I might do a 120 on this side, then I'll turn over and I'll do a 120, then a 240, clean up, turn it over, and then I'll do a 240 and a 400, clean it up, turn it back, 400, 600, clean it up, turn it back, 600. Now if I'm finishing there, sometimes depending on what level of finish I want, I might go up to 800 and then go back to 600 to give me a nice satin finish. It depends how well I think the sanding's gone sometimes. But so I'm only ever going, if I go up, I'll go up 1 grit on one side, and I only go to I make sure that when I turn it over, the next grit I start on is the same as the one on the back. So like I say, so like here I would have started at say 120, turn it, done 120, 240, turn it, 240, 400. And that way there's only ever the same size of grit or slough going under the blade as you've already cleaned it up. And you'll still see little marks, but they come out really, really easy because they're no bigger than what's already on there. So that's a little tip with that one there as well. It does save time in the long run. And like I say, the thing with hand sanding blades, probably as much as anything, unless you're going to a really highly polished handle on some of the materials, you've just got to be honest with yourself. Don't rush it. It all boils down to the level of finish that you want with it, and the time that you're willing to spend on there. So with that, I hope that was reasonably interesting, and I'm going to crack on now and get these on the go, and I will catch you on the flip side, guys.